You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 132. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my friend. Are you ready to talk about procrastination? Yes, so am I. And before we dive in, a couple of things I wanted to share with you. Number one, I just wanted to say thank you. I wanted to thank you for tuning in today, for tuning into all the episodes that you join me for, because I really value having you as my listener. I mean that. I say that from the bottom of my heart. I truly love recording these episodes for you. And I love hearing from you when you share with me that an episode really resonated with you, that there was something in there that you were able to apply in your practice. It means the world to me. And I know you have so much on your plate that there are a number, thousands of other podcasts, probably millions that you could be listening to. And I'm honored and delighted that you choose to spend this time with me. So number one is just a very genuine, heartfelt appreciation, gratitude to you for being here with me this week and for all the weeks that you choose to spend some time with me. So thank you. The second thing I wanted to highlight is that I have a free webinar coming up in a couple of weeks, or I guess a few weeks, on December 15th. It's a Friday. And the webinar is basically designed to help set you up for 2024. I am a huge New Year's kind of person. This should not be a surprise. I am a coach. And if you follow the podcast, you'll see I've done this before. I love setting fresh goals, particularly in the new year, like the new calendar year. And what I would love to do is to offer you, and you are absolutely invited to join me for a free webinar where we're going to set you up for the new year. And the theme is 2024 is the year that ... right? 2024 is the year that you reinvent your practice, that you change jobs, that you expand your team, that you nail down your systems, whatever it is that you have in your mind's eye as something that would just be so delightful, so delicious to accomplish in 2024. That gets to be the focus for you. And so I want to help you do that. I want to help you make 2024 the year that you finally fill in the blank, whatever resonates with you. There will be a link to register along with the show notes to this episode. I will also be sharing it on social media. And if you don't see it somewhere, just send me an email and I can send you the link to register. I'd love to have you join me. I will be talking about my upcoming group coaching and mastermind program. I've mentioned it on the podcast before. I am in the second group that I've run, and I'm going to do another group in January. I've found this process to be absolutely incredible from the perspective of the person who's hosting and leading the discussion and creating the curriculums for the courses that we do. And I'm so excited to welcome another group of lawyers into this program. So I've mentioned it before. It's 6 months. There are 6 themes, 1 theme per month, and a group of up to 8 women lawyers. So if that's something that sounds like it would be of interest to you, I highly encourage you to attend the webinar. If you can't attend live, you can always sign up and I'll send you the recording. And if you have any questions about what is involved in the program, by all means, please do reach out and let me know. I would be delighted to speak with you about it. With that, we're going to dive into procrastination and habits. And specifically, we're going to talk about breaking the habit of procrastination. Now, this can be a problem for many lawyers, and the problem I'm going to specifically address today is when procrastination becomes a habit. So let's take a step back and think about what's going on when procrastination becomes a habit. I'm going to get into some more detailed examples, but first we're going to take that bird's eye view. And what is a habit? Chances are you've got lots of habits already, and We're going to start with the definition that was offered in the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary. And there's actually 3 different ways that they've described habits, and I'm going to read those to you. Number 1, a settled tendency or usual manner of behavior. Number 2, an acquired mode of behavior that has become nearly or completely involuntary. And 3, a behavior pattern acquired by frequent repetition or physiologic exposure that shows itself in regularity or increased facility of performance. So the key words I'd like you to focus on from those 3 definitions is number 1, the idea that a habit is a tendency. It's something that is usual. It's also something that can be acquired. So a habit isn't necessarily something that you were born with. It's something that you learn over time. I will argue that you could also let a habit go. This idea of it being involuntary. So what you might notice with habits that become really deeply ingrained, it's almost like you're not trying to do it. It is effortless or involuntary or unconscious. And then finally, this idea that a behavior pattern is acquired by frequent repetition. So the more times you do something, the more likely it is to become a habit. And it shows itself in regularity. So it keeps coming back. It's something that you see repeatedly. So today we're talking about procrastination and where that might be coming up repeatedly, and facility of performance. And facility of performance is relevant here in the sense that when we create our new habit, so if we're breaking the habit of procrastination, it means we're replacing it with something different. The something different I'm going to propose is that we facilitate the doing by following a process. So that process becomes easier. Facility of performance, that increases over time. I would invite you to think about habits that you already have, because I know you've already got many habits. As humans, we are programmed to acquire habits because it makes life easier. We want to basically downgrade or downregulate things that we do repeatedly to make it easier on our brain. Our brains want to be efficient. If they see patterns, then they're going to want to shove things into that automatic portion of the brain so that we don't need to give it extra thought. So something like brushing your teeth is a habit, something that you very likely do when you wake up in the morning. Before you go to bed, you might be super diligent and brush your teeth after lunch. So there's a habit that you probably already have. For you, it probably feels out of habit. It probably feels less comfortable to go to bed without brushing your teeth than it does to go to bed having brushed your teeth. Another habit might be how you plan your day. So for some of you, you might sit down at your desk, you look at your to-do list and you write out a little note to yourself about what you're going to do that day. Or you do that every week. You sit down, you look at what's on the agenda and you take an inventory about what's coming up. For some of you, you don't have that habit. You have a different habit or no habit at all in terms of planning. And then that would be your habit. So that would look different for you depending on how you approach your days. Answering emails, that might be a habit for you as well. Do you have a habit of responding to emails right away whenever they come into your inbox? Or do you have a habit of checking your emails at multiple points in the day? Do you have a sorting system for how you address your emails? Those are all habits. These are things that you are very likely doing, whether it's conscious or unconscious, that are habits. The way that you speak to people can be a habit. So the way that you speak to your children, for example, or your partner or your friends or the barista at Starbucks, how you answer the phone, right? We all have heard that. We see it in others. We probably see it in ourselves. When you answer the phone professionally, right? You probably put on your more professional voice. Maybe you speak a little bit lower. You're a little bit more polite relative to when you're speaking with your friends in a casual conversation. This is very likely something that has become a habit. So what I'm inviting you to notice is that you're already engaged in a number of habits, and those habits are ones that you have developed over time. And what's interesting about habits is that typically they go from conscious to unconscious. Now, I say typically they are unconscious. Often, so for example, the way that you answer the phone, you may not have set out to do that. It's possible that you consciously set out to do that, but chances are it's an unconscious habit. So what can happen with these habits is that they move from something that you are trying to do into something that you are no longer trying to do. It becomes hardwired. It becomes that involuntary thing, like a reflex, a habit, something that you do just because. And your current habits, in particular, where it comes to procrastination, may be unconscious. You don't really realize that you're doing it, or you don't really know how you got into this habit of procrastination. And what we're doing today is we're working on bringing consciousness to that unconscious habit of procrastination. Now, you may have heard that it takes 21 days to make or break a habit. I have heard the same. I've also heard 28 days. I think what's important for today's discussion is to know that the habit formation period will take some amount of time. And so habit is by doing something repeatedly. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is a process that you can follow, that you can do repeatedly to break that habit of procrastination. Finally, what I'd like you to think about when it comes to habits is that it's all a result of your wiring inside your brain. So we've talked about neuroplasticity on the podcast before. In brief, neuroplasticity is the idea that your brain, the way that it is wired, is plastic, meaning that it can change. So if you're of my vintage, I'm 46 years old at the time of recording. We're in 2023. When I was growing up, the belief predominantly was that your brain formed by the age of 26. And at that point, everything that had been formed was basically fixed. And so that was the brain that you had at 26 years old. And what more recent neuroscience has uncovered is that your brain is actually capable of changing at all stages of life. It might be a little bit more difficult as you get older, but it's entirely possible. And this is the idea that your brain will wire itself to do what you do repeatedly. And where you have habits that you have moved away from, your brain will actually diminish those habits, and it's called pruning. So you can think about this is in a way of, perhaps, I like the forest analogy. You're walking through a forest, it's heavily forested. If you're trying to create a new neural pathway, you'll be hacking away at the forest, chopping down all the branches, trudging your feet through the leafy undergrowth, whatever it is, until you finally have a smooth pathway. And where you may previously have had a smooth pathway, if right now that for you is putting things off, then the less you do that, the more that pathway is going to start to get overgrown with shrubs, etc. You can also think about a white, snowy field where you haven't been stepping. So let's say you have a particular habit, you've been walking the same way across the field, and you've now got that nice, clear pathway. What we're going to ask you to do is to form a new pathway. And so, as you can imagine, same thing with the forest analogy, it can be really hard. It can require a lot of upfront effort in order to change the pathway. But what neuroscience has shown us is that it is absolutely possible. It's absolutely doable. You're going to want to do that with repetition. So when we think about habits and procrastination in particular, procrastination itself can become a habit. When you procrastinate and you procrastinate repeatedly, it can become one of those things that just becomes what you do. And some people will identify themselves as a procrastinator, right? You have tied your self-concept with the act of procrastinating. And what we want to do is distance ourselves from that label. We want to distance ourselves from that habit. And I invite you to think about where it is that you are procrastinating in your life. We'll start with your practice. One that I am guilty of, emails that you don't want to respond to. So I did this on Friday. I had a number of emails I was responding to, and there was this one email, and I thought, I'm going to send this email, and the person who's going to receive it is going to be upset with me. So I don't want to send this email. And I procrastinated. I told myself I'd do it Monday. We're now Wednesday. I still haven't done it. So even though I'm highly aware of it, I am procrastinating. Now, in my defense, I was very tired on Friday. I had a very busy week, and so I just didn't have the mojo to send that email. But it's an example of where this might be happening in your practice. Is that email not being sent because of some reason? Is there a reason why you're pushing it off? This can come up with a contract or an argument, some complex legal drafting that you do not want to do. You're putting it off. You might see it as a big task, overwhelming. You don't know where to start. You know it's going to be painful to write it, whatever. Clients that you don't want to call. You might have clients. You might have colleagues. You may have individuals in your professional life who you know to be difficult, or you dread having conversations with them, and so you procrastinate. You might have a dog file. I think at some point or another, we all get to experience the file that languishes in the file cabinet, one that probably got passed down to you from another lawyer at some point in your career. And it's one of those slow moving, ultra painful, or maybe it's fast moving, but if it was fast moving, you'd probably be on it. There'd be some adrenaline there. But it's one of these slow paced, maybe not super important until it becomes important kind of files. So maybe there's something like that you've been putting off and you might be thinking about it right now, in which case I apologize, but maybe that's a really great example for us to think about as you go through today's podcast episode. Outside of work, there may be things that you procrastinate on, scheduling doctor's appointments. It might be exercise. This can be a really tricky one. If you have a class that you have after work, or you tell yourself you're going to go for a run after work and you find that you get to the end of the day and all of a sudden you feel just so tired, and the idea of putting on your running shoes or going to the gym is so unpalatable. And so instead you decide not to do it. And then that starts happening repeatedly. And then the habit becomes, instead of going to the gym or going for a run after work, you don't get your exercise in. So these are the types of things that I'd invite you to think about in terms of procrastination. Where do you see yourself as having a habit of procrastination? Now, typically what happens when you procrastinate is the thing comes up, right? The thing that you don't want to do comes up and you try to persuade yourself to do it. And this is one of the really sticky and pernicious parts about procrastination, is that usually in the moment where you're procrastinating, you absolutely know that this is something that you need to do. So on some level, you want to do it, right? If you're sitting down to draft that argument and it's painful and you know you're going to have to do it, there is a deadline and it is coming up. And if you don't do it now, you're going to have to do it then. And so you know that the consequences are going to be potentially painful if you put it off, and yet you don't do it, right? This is me with my email on Friday. I knew I needed to send it, but I chose not to send it. Now, in that case, there's no immediate consequences. It's not a big deal email or anything like that. But I still knew in the moment I was just delaying something that I could have done. Now, the reason why this doesn't work, unfortunately, is that knowing that you need to do something, right? Knowing at a logical level that the task that you're putting off will need to be done probably by you at some point in the future, and it's not going away. It's not going to get easier. That knowledge alone doesn't necessarily get you over the energetic threshold that is required to actually do the thing. And I would like to blame it on faulty wiring of the human brain. I mean, I think we all know we are motivated by pleasure. We want to do things that we enjoy. We typically want to avoid things that are painful, and we want to conserve energy. As humans, that is how we are designed. And it's almost like there's faulty wiring in our system that makes us think, we would trade that temporary comfort in exchange for greater discomfort down the road. And sometimes people will ask you, would you rather win $1 million in the lottery or win a penny and it doubles every day for 30 days or something like that? My son actually asked me this very same question not too long ago. And we know when we're asked that question that the penny that doubles is worth more than $1 million. So of course we would pick the penny that doubles. But the reality is that sometimes you're in that situation where you're faced with the thing that you don't want to do, and you choose that temporary comfort of not doing it, of avoiding it, even though you know that the long-term consequences are going to be more painful. It's just something that we do as humans. And so that's why what we want to do here is focus on how we can rewire that habit so that it becomes more natural, more comfortable, almost that involuntary reflex to simply do the thing that you want to put off instead of having that procrastination be something that you engage in. So what happens, of course, when you procrastinate is you put off the task, you avoid it. That creates more stress. It may be that you're thinking about it that whole time. You're worried about it. It's not getting done. You're telling yourself you should do it. And then you may find that you have to rush at the last minute, especially if you're dealing with an argument that you're submitting to court, or you're working on a deal and there's a contract and you know you need to draft it and you've promised that it will be to the client on Friday and now it's Thursday afternoon and you haven't started it and it's painful. You're rushing at the last minute. it might be a difficult conversation that you're putting off, and you know that that conversation isn't getting easier. Most of the time, it can actually get worse, especially if it's time sensitive. And so you procrastinate, you eventually get the thing done, or something else happens that intervenes sometimes. And you didn't really like the process, but interestingly, you find yourself doing it again. You find yourself creating a pattern of procrastination. And the more you do it, the more it becomes habit, which is what we're talking about today, right? That habit of procrastination. So by repetition, remember going back to those definitions offered by the Merriam-Webster dictionary, is that repetition, it becomes usual. It may even feel involuntary. It might feel like, again, maybe you've identified yourself as a procrastinator. This is just what you do. It's who you are. And it becomes that habit. So sadly, when you engage in this habit, chances are you do not enjoy the time you spend procrastinating. So you might think in the moment, oh, it's so great because instead of writing that really complicated argument, instead I'm going to, scroll on social media. Maybe do something a little bit better, like go for a dinner with a friend, or maybe you go for a run at the gym, or you tidy out your inbox. That's always something that seems to get done when trying to avoid a really painful task. But you do something else, but you're not truly enjoying that time because in the back of your mind, you're worried about the thing that you're not doing. Now, you may also experience a lot of self-judgment, right? You're sitting there, you're procrastinating, and you're blaming yourself. You're like, oh, Paula, you always do this. You have these emails and you don't want to send them. And so you let them sit in your inbox, you avoid them. And then eventually, you're going to have to send it. So you might be having something like that where you're giving yourself a bit of a lecture. And finally, you might also feel completely exhausted because eventually you need to do the task, but you've done it with all this extra effort, all this negotiating with yourself over when you're going to do it. There's uncertainty over when you're going to do it. There's that self-judgment that you might be layering up on top of it. And so the result, of course, is you've developed this habit and you're not really even enjoying that time, and you know it. So what we're going to talk about today is how to break up with that habit of procrastination. And as we talk about it, first of all, habits can be really great habits, and some habits you want, right? Like getting up early to go for a run. If that's a habit that you like, it's a habit I have. I really love it. It's not a habit that I want to break up with. But the point here is that procrastination typically is a habit that causes you discomfort and pain. And so that's why we want to examine it and form a new habit. Now, we've talked a little bit about habits. I've offered the dictionary definition, or a dictionary definition. What I would also like to offer you is a little bit about how habits work. And there's a gentleman by the name of Charles Duhigg who has written an excellent book called The Power of Habit. It is way more detailed than we're going to dive into today. The thing I want to extract from that book, which is very straightforward and very simple, is that a habit is comprised of 3 different steps: a cue, a response, and a reward. Cue, response, reward. So we are going to apply this very specifically to procrastination. We're going to look at the cue. Where is it that you procrastinate? We're going to look at the response. How do you respond when you procrastinate? And then finally, what is the reward that you receive? And typically in a procrastination context, the reward is temporary relief from having to do the unpleasant task ahead of you. So let's dive into step 1 and focus on the cue. Here, what you are doing in this podcast episode is identifying your specific cues. Now, in this 3-part habit model, the cue, response, reward, what Charles Duhigg says is that the cue is going to stay the same. When you go to change a habit, you're actually going to keep the cue. What's going to be different are the response and the reward. So let's identify where it is that you know you are going to procrastinate. You might think of this as a trigger. You might think of it as a cue. Ultimately, this is the thing where you know you're likely to procrastinate. So I've given some of these examples. I'll repeat some of them. That email that you don't want to send. It's that complex drafting that you don't want to do. It's the conversation with a difficult client or colleague. It's sitting down to plan out your week or your day. It's exercise. It's going to bed on time. So whatever you are procrastinating on, we want you to identify what they are. Now, you know that when one of these cues comes up, you're very likely to push it off. So maybe when you sit down and you've got that email that you don't want to send, you have a certain habit, right? You maybe file it away or you do something, right? We're going to want to think about what your cue leads to in terms of response. I'll get to that in a moment, but you want to identify that. And the reason you want to get really clear about what your cues are is because then you get to prepare for them. And what that means is we're going to plan for a completely different response. We're going to expect that you're going to want to procrastinate, and then we have a plan for it. And if you want, you can even make this a bit of a game, right? Now that we're on the path, right? We are breaking the habit of procrastination. We're going to make this as fun as we can make it. We're going to make it a game. And so we need to start by learning what your cues are. And they may be coming to you right now as you're listening to me talk about it during this podcast. They will start to come to you even after we've been talking, because you'll start to notice. You'll be like, aha, I see how I'm putting off clearing the dishes from the kitchen counter. Aha, I see how I'm pushing off actually going to bed when I said I would. I've been doing this lately. I mentioned it in a podcast recently. I've formed the habit of scrolling through reels before bed. It's a terrible habit. I should not be doing it. It wastes time. It's not all that rewarding, and it's pushing my bedtime back. So there's a habit that I need to unlearn. So for you, it's looking at where is this procrastination habit coming up and writing it down or making a mental list, but you want to become very clear about your inventory, about your cues. So the second thing, once we've identified your cues, is to deal with the response. Now, chances are, if you have a habit of procrastination, the response that you have will look something like this. First, you're going to feel dread about the task and you're going to resist it, right? That resistance is going to set in. I'm not going to set that email. I don't want to write that memo. I'm not going to go to the gym. The second thing that might be happening here is that you judge yourself for resisting. Oh, this is so typical. I always do this. I leave it to the last minute, or I never want to do it, or I put this off until the last minute. So just notice what's happening there is you're probably judging yourself because you are procrastinating. Now, the third thing you might be doing is making the task worse in your head than it is in real life. You might be catastrophizing about what's going to happen, right? I'm going to send the email and I'm going to get this angry phone call and it's going to be terrible. Maybe you're mind reading, anticipating what other people are going to think about you. You might be playing out all these different scenarios about what that might look like. You might be thinking about that argument that you're writing and you're going to send it off and it's going to be terrible and you're going to lose. It's not going to be good enough. The other side's going to have a better one. You might imagine yourself doing that task and feeling excruciatingly bored. Maybe you've got a really tedious assignment and you don't want to sit down. You know there's going to be a lot of really detail-oriented things that you need to do and you dread it. You might feel restless during the entire task. So whatever it is that's going through your mind, you are creating a scenario that is increasingly unpalatable, which leads you to step 4, which is convincing yourself not to do it, right? This is typical. I'll do it tomorrow. Me, last Friday, I'll send that email next week. Now is not a good time. This can wait. And once you convinced yourself, which is pretty easy to do after that step 3, where you've made that task into this gargantuan endeavor that you just really don't want to deal with. So you've convinced yourself, not a good idea. And then finally you don't do it, right? You actually just avoid it. You put it off. And so your response is now complete, right? You've gone from that resisting to judging yourself to really creating an imagined version of what that's going to be like. And it's really dreadful. You convince yourself not to do it and then you don't do it. So there you go. And what I'm going to offer you now is a different response, right? We're going to untrain that habit of procrastination and create a new habit, which is into action. So what does that look like? And we've got those 5 steps. So I'm going to follow that same outline. And we're basically going to do the opposite of each of those steps. So the first step, or the first thing that we noticed, was that resisting, right? That feeling of dread, that resistance to the task. So we're just going to accept it for what it is. And Byron Katie is a thought leader. She has written many books. She has some really interesting ideas about thoughts and reframing thoughts and challenging thoughts. And one of the things that she says, which I absolutely love, is she says, you can argue with reality and you will only lose 100% of the time. So anytime you resist something that is on your desk, this is a task, you must do it. Nobody else can do it for you. When you resist it, you're basically arguing with the reality. I shouldn't have to do this. It shouldn't be me writing this email. I shouldn't have to do this argument. The argument shouldn't be so difficult. These should statements, right? It should be different than it is. You're arguing with reality. So instead of that argument, because it can actually take a lot of energy to expend, even if you're just arguing in your own mind, we're just going to accept, yeah, there is this email and it needs to be written. We're going to accept. So step number 1, instead of resisting it, we are accepting it. It will make a big, big difference. Number 2 is to have self-compassion. So in that first model that we talked about, you were judging yourself for resisting it, judging yourself for procrastinating. And here, instead of doing that, we're going to take all that judgment away, all of it. Like, it feels so liberating. What you're going to offer yourself instead is something that sounds like this. Of course you want to put this off, right? Of course you're going to want this off. And then you give yourself the reason. Of course you're going to want to put this off. You're tired. You need to send this email. And there is a chance that so-and-so will be upset when they receive it. That's okay, right? It's perfectly understandable that you would feel like that. So hear these words and write them down if you need them. I highly love and recommend, of course you want to do X, right? Acknowledge that for yourself. Give yourself that feeling of relief and acknowledgement that, yeah, this is a task that is difficult. And of course you're going to feel like that. It's perfectly understandable. And that leads you to ask yourself, where do we go from here, right? We've accepted it. We're not blaming ourselves because we don't want to do it or we're pushing it off. It's that self-compassion. Of course you don't want to do it. It's going to be difficult. You think it's going to be difficult, whatever that is. And then that moves us into the next phase, which is awareness. So if your natural tendency is to create this drama in your mind about what you expect that task to be like, instead what we're going to do is we're going to increase the awareness about what you think, and we're going to increase awareness about what the facts actually are. So what you may be thinking is, this email is going to upset somebody. You are going to get into this task and it's going to be terrible and tedious and boring. You don't want to do it. And then you might ask yourself, but really, what are the facts here? And the facts might be all you're doing in this moment is writing an email that contains information. It will take you a certain amount of time to write that email, maybe 10 minutes. If you look at that really tedious task, it might be, you're going to be writing a list, right? You're going to sit down. You're going to need to read through a number of documents. You're going to have to decide what's important and put it in a list. That might take you 20 minutes. So what you're wanting to do is, instead of having this highly electrified vision of how awful it's going to be. And remember, part of that vision was leading you to that decision of not doing it. And we know already that what we want to do is to do it. So we're on to ourselves. And so we're just trying to really reduce the overwhelm. We're trying to reduce the spinning thoughts or the unhelpful thoughts. We're trying to cut through the cloud of what you are building up in your mind's eye. And instead, we're going to make this thing less scary and more manageable and more doable. So that third step is, again, instead of blowing that task out of proportion or making it worse in your mind than it needs to be, we're just kind of getting aware of what we're thinking about it. What are the labels that we might be using to describe this task? Is it the worst task ever? Is it, this dreadful argument? Whatever it is that you're describing, we're just going to notice that. We're going to separate what we're thinking as opinion and what the true facts actually are. And then that leads us to step 4. Instead of convincing yourself not to do it, so you've got all this evidence, all these reasons as to why it's a terrible thing and why you should avoid it, instead we're actually just going to do it a little bit differently. We're going to reframe that story that you're telling yourself. And instead of persuading yourself to procrastinate, we are going to persuade you are going to persuade yourself to take a single step. So in the old version of it, you might be thinking, I just don't want to do this. I can do it tomorrow. I will do it tomorrow. Instead, what you're going to tell yourself is, I just need to get started. I only need to spend 10 minutes. It will be faster if I send it now. I'm learning not to procrastinate. I can do this even if I feel uncomfortable. So you're going to give yourself new words in your own mind that are going to help you to reframe the scenario. And ultimately, number 5, is to take a step. So step 5 in the original habit was you don't do it, you avoid it, you put it off. The new habit is you take a step. You take a step in the direction of getting this thing done. So just to recap there, what happens now is you have your cue, you know what your cue is. And instead of doing something unconscious that leads you to procrastination and putting things off, not doing them, you're now instead accepting that there's this thing that you don't want to do. You are being compassionate with yourself. Of course, you don't want to do it. This is a task that you perceive as difficult. That's okay. Where do we go from here? Having awareness about what you think, how you're characterizing that task, how you're creating an image of that in your mind's eye, what is actually going on here, what is actually required of you. And then we're going to reframe that story. So it is no longer, I don't really need to do this today. I can do it tomorrow. And that just becomes, all I need to do is get started. I just need to do one thing, and that will lead you to taking that step. And if you need resources when it comes to how to approach procrastination, I have all sorts of episodes about breaking down tasks, about the relationship between your executive functioning skills and task initiation. So if you want to find those, we'll link to some of those in the show notes. You're also welcome to scroll through the podcast episodes. You can search them by putting procrastinate in, and you will find episodes about procrastination. So there's lots there in the podcast series to help support you when it comes to procrastination. So going back to our habit, we've talked about the cue, we've talked about the response, and then finally the reward. And you want to have a reward because that's going to help you anchor this as a new habit. So you typically, the reward in the unconscious model of this is that you have that temporary relief of not having to do something that you're dreading. We're going to shift that over. So let's say you send that email. Let's say you draft the first 3 paragraphs of your argument. Let's say you set up a meeting to have a conversation that you've been avoiding. So you've taken a step in the direction of what it is that you need to do. And now you get to give yourself that reward. So the reward can be the fact that you've actually accomplished the thing that you didn't want to do. That in itself is satisfying. So acknowledge it. Acknowledge that, yes, I have had that conversation. I've sent that email. It's off my desk. I no longer have to think about it until maybe you get a response, but it's done. Your portion of that thing is now complete, and that is satisfying and freeing. You might give yourself a tangible reward, like a marble in a jar. You might put a marble in a jar every time you find yourself wanting to procrastinate, but then managing that process and instead taking some form of action. You might have little sticks that you draw on a piece of paper, some other way of keeping a score. And the purpose of that is just to give yourself further recognition of the fact that you are doing this. You're building a new habit. You can tell yourself, good job, give yourself a pat on the back. You can give yourself a treat, right? Some people might respond well to giving themselves the treat, like maybe you take yourself to a movie or go with friends or give yourself a cup of tea, right? If it's a small task that you're doing in the day, maybe you say, okay, after I send these 5 emails, I'm going to go get myself a fresh cup of tea. You might have a walk with a friend or by yourself. You might reward yourself with food treats. Maybe, I don't know, you give yourself a chocolate or something. I don't love using food as a reward, but that can be a reward. And then one of the biggest rewards that you will be able to give yourself as this becomes a habit, as it becomes entrenched, is that self-concept that you can step into, right? You are no longer a procrastinator. You are a person who gets things done. And you can tell yourself that that is part of your reward. And what you want to do with these 3 steps then is when you're looking at the cue, you are noticing them and you are following those cues with an intentional response, a conscious response instead of that unconscious response. And then you are rewarding yourself. You're going to be developing a new habit, right? You are developing new habits when it comes to procrastination. You're going to be practicing these habits. You're going to be repeating these habits, and you're going to keep doing this until the habit takes shape and this starts to become more natural for you. Believe it or not, the more you do this, the more it will feel natural to execute, and the more it will feel unnatural to put things off. And just to follow up on that point, you probably already have places in your life where you have done this, where you have taken a habit, you have taken something and you have made it into a habit that you do. So for example, I've mentioned on the podcast before, I exercise first thing in the morning. My alarm goes off, usually 5 a.m. on a weekday, and it feels more normal and natural for me to get up, get out of bed and do the exercise that I do. I've got a schedule that's easy for me. It's something that I follow. That feels good. That feels right. I feel off on the days that I don't do it because it's a habit, because it's so deeply ingrained. So why this process is going to work for you, number one, is you're approaching procrastination like a scientist, right? If you've got this habit, it's unconscious, you're not really thinking about it, you just know it comes up and you don't like it, you're not really doing anything specific or proactive to deal with it. This way, you're approaching it like a scientist. You expect it. You know what's going to happen. You know what your cues are. You've got a plan to follow, and you can test that plan and adapt it as you go. Another big shift here is you're going to be kind to yourself, right? If your usual way of dealing with procrastination is to judge yourself, to blame yourself, to beat yourself up, to put yourself through this really unpleasant process of putting things off and doing it at the last minute and feeling badly and stressed the whole time, this process is quite different because you're actually being nice to yourself. You'll find that is less exhausting, and what happens over time is you start to build your confidence and you build your trust with yourself. So you can imagine every time you have that negotiation with yourself where you're telling yourself, okay, no, I'll do it now. No, I'll do it tomorrow. No, tomorrow comes around. You still don't do it. You're breaking down that trust. If you had somebody in your life where you were having that conversation and you're constantly going back and forth, you're undermining that trust with that person. And the same thing happens with yourself. And so as you follow through on the things that you know that you want to do, that you should be doing, the more that you develop that relationship, the more trust you're going to have with yourself. You will then also start to form a habit. So remember this idea of whether it's 21 days or 28 days, I don't think it really matters. I think what you are focused on is, are you developing that habit? And whether it takes you 21 days or 21 months, frankly, I would not give up on something like this if it's important to you. So you get to keep going. The more you do this, the more it becomes a habit, the more it becomes involuntary, unconscious. You don't need to think about it so much. It becomes your default. And then finally, your default wiring will adjust and it will feel more natural to you to follow your new habit than your old habit. So as I just mentioned with the running example, the reason that this is such an effective way to deal with that habit of procrastination is that once you rewire that habit, once it is no longer your default, that's going to feel natural to you. And so it's not you using willpower or being forceful into not procrastinating. It is just who you are. Now, in terms of what you will need to do in order to implement this strategy to develop these new habits is you're going to need to have a lot of self-awareness, right? You know what your cues are because we've talked about those in the podcast. And when you have that cue come up, you're going to need to pause. You're going to have to notice that you're procrastinating. And if that is the only thing that you take from this podcast episode, you're already so much further ahead of the game because you're going to start to see it. And once you see it, then you can start deciding whether or not you want to do something about it. And you might choose not to. You might find that procrastination is working for you, that it doesn't cause any problems for you, in which case you might think about other habits that maybe you would like to change because you can use the same type of process that we've outlined here. But in any event, what you're going to need to do anytime you change a habit, and here we're talking about procrastination, is you notice the cues and you pause. Then you're going to want to choose to respond differently. So you will need to choose to apply this process, or if you want to modify the process, go right ahead, do what works for you. But you're going to choose to do something different than what you normally do. You're going to need to be kind to yourself. Now, if you are used to judging yourself, maybe beating yourself up over times that you procrastinate, this is going to feel quite foreign to you, right? Because this is not what you're used to. So part of this habit is being kind. So you may need to practice being kind to yourself, to be speaking to yourself with compassion. Of course, you want to procrastinate. This is a task that is going to be challenging. You can have that conversation with yourself, and it's so much more empowering. It's going to create so much less resistance and stress in your life. It's so much more inviting to take steps forward than when you are judging yourself and being unkind to yourself. You are also going to need a willingness to keep adjusting. So you can test this out. You will see where it's hard for you to implement. You will learn to adapt. You will learn to make changes. You will also learn to refine a process that works for you. And as you build a practice that is not procrastinating, a practice that is taking action, what you'll find is that things will change. So you might find that you go through a period where you're really good, you're not procrastinating, and then all of a sudden work explodes and you're putting out fires and, things are really intense. And then there's a lull that follows, and you might find then that it's it's really difficult to get yourself motivated and that you're procrastinating all over again. That might be happening for you right now. You might have a day where it's kind of slow at the office and you know you need to do things, but you don't want to because it's quiet. There's no urgency and you just don't feel like you have the energy. That's a great time to practice this skill of overcoming procrastination, of breaking that habit of procrastination. So just know that you'll have a practice, you'll be building that practice, and there are going to be times where your practice just falls off the rails, and that's okay because you can always come back. You can always come back and start to rebuild. The nature of your work may also change. As your practice evolves over time, the tasks ahead of you will become different, and you might find that cues that were previously places where you would procrastinate, they no longer even apply in your practice, but there are new areas where you tend to procrastinate. Maybe you reach a point in the practice where you're doing a lot more delegation and you find that you put off delegating or training new staff because there's a really heavy in your mind initial investment of time and energy that is required. And so you're putting that off. So now you'll see, okay, here's something where I'm now procrastinating. I'm going to learn how to manage that procrastination. And here's a method that you can use to start to do that. Now, what will happen when you do this, of course, when you practice this, when you alter your habits, is that you'll find that you have a different relationship with procrastination. So if you've ever had a breakup, right, where you've broken up with a person or you've broken up with a job or you've broken up with another habit, and then some time passes and then you go back and you're like, oh, I don't really get why I did that in the first place, right? If you used to really be addicted to Oreo cookies or peanut butter cups or something, and okay, peanut butter cups are pretty good, but let's say there's something that you used to have as a habit and you stepped away from it and then you went back to it and you realize, you know what? I don't really understand why I was so fixated on this thing, because when I look at it now, I don't get it, right? Because you've moved so far in who you are and in your thinking. So that's how we're going to feel about procrastination. You're going to reach that point where it's like, oh, okay, I know that I used to procrastinate on this, but now it doesn't feel like me anymore. You won't procrastinate as much. So I think you will, I hate to say it, I think you will still procrastinate. My experience of being human and of other people being human is that we all will procrastinate here and there from time to time. What we're talking about today, what we're focused on, is really that habit of procrastination and breaking the habit. But sometimes you might fall into that scenario where you do, maybe it's a pattern, a temporary pattern of going back to procrastination. Then we want to pull it back and we want to recalibrate. Or maybe there's just certain things, little one-offs, and that's fine. That's totally normal. But you'll notice, right? When you feel that urge to put things off, you'll recognize it. And then you'll know that you have a process that you can use to bring things back and to, get back on track, whatever that looks like for you. You'll develop a more compassionate relationship with yourself. So again, when you start to do this work, when you start to follow this practice instead of that harsh judgment, you'll find that you're much kinder to yourself. Your relationship with yourself is improved. You'll have that trust and you'll know that you'll follow through on what you say you're going to do. And then finally, and I've just mentioned this, but it's that distance, right? It's that distance from procrastination and being so caught up into it. And you'll see it more objectively for what it is. And you will no longer feel connected to it. It will no longer be an unconscious habit that is part of your practice. So that is what I have to share with you today in terms of breaking up with procrastination. Thank you again for joining me here today. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm so grateful to have you here. It is an honor that you choose to spend your time with me. I think today's episode will hopefully save you time, right? As you apply this going forward. If procrastination is something that is costing you time, then your investment with me today will pay off. And then finally, just wanted to reiterate that I will be having that webinar on December 15th. It's a Friday at noon Pacific time. We're going to help set you up for the new year. 2024 is the year that you will, right? 2024 is the year that you will finally, right? Whatever that happens to be for you. Really, really excited to spend that time with you to help set you up for 2024. Registration details will be on the webpage with this podcast episode. Again, reach out to me if you have any questions about it. And of course, we'll be talking about the group coaching and mastermind program that I'll be offering in January 2024 to help support you in creating what it is that you want next year. And so with all of that being said, thank you again. It's been a pleasure, and I very much look forward to connecting with you again next week. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.